Welcome everyone to this edition of OTF Connects in our Spring 2020 series, What Works for Me Might Work for You, and more specifically to this new Literacies for Digital Learners facilitated by Leigh Cassell. And Lindy kindly read her bio for you. We'll put that, and she's put that in the chat box as well. I did want to say that because we are all joining from different places in Ontario, that I'd like to observe that we acknowledge that we are gathered in the territories of various Indigenous peoples, and furthermore, we recognize their stewardship of these lands in which we live, learn, work, and play. So welcome everyone to this series. And Leigh, we're going to turn it over to you. I'm just going to stop sharing here, and then we're going to move to your slide deck, and I'll let you know when we're ready to go.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. As Ian was saying, technology is our friend till it's not. And I was actually on a Zoom call earlier today with a password and had no issues, so I'm not sure what's up. But I definitely got to flex some of those digital literacy muscles, trying to figure out how to best communicate this session with you based on our current circumstances. So I think Ian and I have come up with a good way to do that. Ian, do you have the title slide up and ready?
No, just give me 1 second, please.
You bet. So while Ian's doing that, I'm going to ask everyone in the room just to think about the definition of literacy, because in a minute I'm going to ask you to share some of your thoughts in the chat in terms of how you would define literacy, what that means to you.
Okay, it's up.
Can you? Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. So if you don't mind advancing to slide number 2, the next slide.
You bet.
And so those of you that are in the house tonight, or today, this afternoon, I guess, share some of your thoughts about literacy and what that means to you. And Ian, if you don't mind just sharing some of those as they come in, that would be great.
You bet, I can do that.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Mm-hmm.
It's being able to understand a message, communication, reading, writing.
Yep. A couple more ideas.
Yeah. Oral language.
Mm-hmm.
Communication skills, reading and writing. Oral literacy is the ability to interact with people, to understand and be understood. Reading, writing, oral language, it's oral language.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah, okay.
Next slide, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. Literacy encompasses a lot of things. What I found really interesting when I searched dictionary.com and Merriam-Webster's, the definition of literacy in the dictionary is actually read, write, and repeat. Next slide, please. I think we would all agree in this space that definition is hugely insufficient and really doesn't encapsulate what it actually means to be literate. This image here is taken from a hole-in-the-wall experiment, which you may.
Ian, we've lost Leigh. Ian?
But it's really not possible to speak of illiterate and literate persons as two distinct categories. Next slide, please. We really want to focus on our understanding of literacy on a spectrum. And I think we can all agree that we are all more literate and maybe less literate in certain spaces. And I know moving our learning and literacy instruction into digital environments means that that creates some feelings of uncomfortableness because we are moving into a space where we may not feel as literate as our students or as literate as we should be. But I'm going to bring your attention to some things today that you can do in your classrooms with your students that will help build your digital literacy skills and theirs at the same time. Next slide, please. So the next piece that I want to just quickly tap into, and I'd love for you to share your thinking again in the chat here. How do you define text? What does that mean to you when we say text? And here's a chance for you to flex some of those digital literacy muscles. What does text mean to you? And Ian, if you don't mind sharing those with me, that would be great.
So people can add that to the chat box. words, printed message, actual words, written word, a code for communication, written form, images, anything that communicates an idea.
Yep.
Words, messages, communication that has meaning, visual.
Okay.
There's a few.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Next slide, please. I want to come back to that idea, anything that communicates a message. And that's really how we need to think about text today. And that's one of the things that, that's one of the ways the internet has changed literacy instruction and our thinking about what it means to be literate and how we define text. Text comes in all different forms. And you can see I've captured just a few different examples here, whether it's a video game or, using a search engine or engaging in a video conference, watching a TED Talk, tweeting, blogging, using social media. All of those different platforms also double as text forms, and I'm going to dig into that shortly. Next slide, please. One of the important messages that I want to resonate with you today is that literacy has always been defined by technology and will continue to be defined by technology. And it's why our profession, why it's so important, I guess, in our profession to ensure that our instruction is evolving with technology and with new technologies that are being made available that students are using, because their skills or their ability as a literate individual will determine their success in these new spaces. Next slide, please. And I just want to bring some context to that. And I start with this Edison slide because Edison, a long time ago, claimed that the motion picture would revolutionize the education system and that at some point it would largely, if not entirely, supplement the use of textbooks. Next slide, please. What if we swapped out motion picture and replaced that with YouTube? I think an argument could be made again that YouTube, for a time, really shifted a change in the system and how we are accessing information online. Next slide, please.
Leigh, I just want to check that you're on slide 12 and we're moving to 13.
I'm on slide 12. Is it easier if I say what number? Was that helpful for you?
No, it's okay. We're moving to 13 now.
Yeah. So we're on slide 12 right now? Yeah.
Yes, moving to 13.
Perfect. Yeah, so in the 1940s and 50s, we moved away from that idea of, and I'm coming back to Edison here, this motion picture, and we started to introduce as well the idea of the radio broadcast. And so we have the motion picture, and that's definitely made its mark in education and as a tool for communication, or a platform, a text form for communication. And we have the radio broadcast, which in this picture you can see students in the classroom are actually listening to a radio broadcast, and what they're doing is they are following instructions to make paper animals. And so this is a snapshot of then. And next slide, please. Ian, if you don't mind hitting play on this little video here in a second, this is what it looks like today, where instead of through a radio broadcast, students are being given instructions actually to create sheep in celebration of Year of the Sheep via video conference with the Old Gel Art Center in the United States.
You want to play the video?
Yes, please.
Here we go.
It's just a short
about texture. Let's start with the soft wool. Now, students, we are not going to glue our cotton down in little balls like this. Sheep don't have perfect little balls on their bodies like that. No, we are going to make this look more realistic. So I want you to watch my hands. I'm going to take my cotton, and instead of a little ball, I want to stretch it out to where I have some nice, skinny, long cotton to glue down.
Okay, you can
so you're going to take the cotton ball.
So let's do this now.
You're going to
All right,
stretch.
next slide, please. And of course, I know there are some people here today that recognize this computer. I am still using Apple products today, but the Mac that I'm on at home does not look like that. And I'm sure some of you can also remember the exciting game of, I think it's called, I don't know if it was tennis, the two sticks and the ball bouncing back and forth on the screen. And that's what technology looked like then. And when that technology was introduced, it required people to learn a new set of skills. It required them to transfer or make connections between the literacy skills they used in an analog world and apply those in a digital world. Next slide, please. And here's a quick little clip of a student using a computer today doing some coding work. You'll have to let me know when this one's done, Ian. There's no audio.
Yeah, will do.
All right.
Okay, it's done.
All right. And so what you're seeing there is a student reading and taking in all of that information within that given game and translating that into a set of actions that achieved the result that he was celebrating at the end. And I can see this is a student that I taught years ago, and he spent probably I'm going to say probably 2 hours total of time over a number of days trying to problem solve and think his way through this level. And in order to do so, he's not only demonstrating his ability to think computationally, but he's also demonstrating literacy skills. Next slide, please. So number 16. And what I want to highlight here is that it's not about the tool, right? The tool is just the Trojan horse. Next slide. The focus here is that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that's one of the big ideas I'm going to come back to in this, in our understanding of new literacies. It's really about our ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Because, next slide, please. Getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. And I imagine there are people in the room that have experienced that on more than one occasion. Next slide, please. And what I've included here is just a snapshot of the internet in 60 seconds. And I want to just give you a second to sort of browse around all of these spaces. And it's something that I want to come back to what I mentioned earlier about each of these platforms, and you'll recognize a lot of these social media spaces. I'm sure some of you are active users in a lot of these spaces. But these spaces also double as text forms. When we think about Twitter as a platform, and I'm going to specifically highlight Twitter in a little while, there are multiple text forms that can be created in order to communicate on that platform. The same holds true for Instagram and for Facebook, and when we're using Google as a search engine. Each of those spaces requires us to apply a certain set of literacy skills, make connections between what we do again in an analog world and what that looks like or how it translates in a digital space. Next slide, please. And one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're teaching literacy, and regardless if it's a subject onto it on its own or if it's being integrated into other subject areas, is what changes with ubiquitous access? Now that all of our students, and again, you may be in a space where your students all have technology or they don't, but one of the questions we need to be asking ourselves, even with students in kindergarten, and I teach kindergarten, okay? And I'm going to make reference to some of what this looks like in kindergarten for some those of you that are here in primary. When students have access to information, that really, for us as a profession, signals a shift that we need to make in terms of our role and what we're offering students. Next slide, please. Because today, and this is true now more than ever, the world only cares about what you can do with what you know. It's not as concerned about how you learned it. And this is a phrase that definitely, I think, challenges some of the ideas that we have about school and education. But more importantly, what I want you to take away from this is that it's the skills that students are developing that are really, really valuable today, more so than the content. They can find the content. Anyone can find the content now. It doesn't matter what subject you teach, that information is out there. What's missing are the skills that students need to be able to locate that information, effectively evaluate it, synthesize it, and communicate it in a way that's meaningful. Next slide, please. And this slide, and you may have seen these before, these are, there's actually two slides, so we'll start here just as a quick reference, and then we'll move to the next one. The focus in our spaces today, and this, has been communicated provincially, not just by the ministry, but within each of your respective school districts, is that skill sets, those transferable skills, they've also been called 21st century competencies. They've also been called global competencies. The current language around that is transferable skills and how we're developing these transferable skills. And I like the shift in language because really that's what we're asking students to do is transfer a set of skills they have, again, from that analog space into that digital space. But that it's not a direct, if I do this here, I can do this here. There's a shift that needs to take place. And And within that shift is the requirement of students to learn some of these new literacies that we're going to be speaking about today. And these skill sets fall under that umbrella. Next slide, please. So we also have the final set of 3 here, and this is you do have access to this deck at the end, and I am going to buzz through some slides because they're in this deck to serve as a reference and a resource for you, so I won't spend a lot of time unpacking them. But if you haven't reviewed the 21st Century Competencies document, I highly recommend you do. It's a great read, and it brings a lot of context to the conversation. Next slide, please. Speaking about context, context matters, and it's a point that I'm going to come to, another point I'm going to come back to more than once in this space. Teaching students digital media literacy in the context of our classrooms, using art supplies like paper and crayons and markers and scissors, makes it a very difficult task to actually teach the digital literacy skills. You need to be in a digital environment if you want kids to develop digital literacy skills. It seems common sense, but I know and I've seen it, and I mean, I was one of those teachers years ago who tackled the media literacy curriculum by having students draw posters to mimic, advertisements, or, I mean, I think the cereal box, anyone that's in elementary here knows that, design an ad for a cereal box, right? Or create your own brand. The issue with that is that students are working in a digital environment. They're not exploring digital, and they're only really exploring a very, very small part of that expectation. When we really, next slide, please. What we want to do in order to be effective, in order to help students and also help ourselves, is to immerse ourselves in these spaces. And I don't mean that we're going to put a student on an iPad or a Chromebook or any device, for the entire school day. That's not what I mean. But when we're talking about media literacy or digital literacy, students need to be working in digital environments. And that just makes sense. The more time they spend in those spaces, the more fluent and fluid they will become working in those spaces. Next slide, please. And I want to draw your attention now to new literacies, and that it's really about seeing the forest. And I will reference this again in my session. New literacies is about seeing the forest, and I want to draw your attention to some of the things that I've spoken to already. And again, very high level and brief, but I'm just trying to frame this experience or this concept of new literacies for you. New literacies encompasses global competencies, right? So it's developing skill sets. And in a lot of ways, those skills need to be developed in digital environments in the same way they need to be developed in analog environments. I talked about learning, unlearning, and relearning and how important those skills are. And that really addresses a lot of the future trends in education right now, specifically adaptability and students being able to shift not only in their careers, but also in the tasks they're being asked to do in those careers, as an example. Some new pedagogies, which I haven't touched on, but I'm coming to shortly. And those traditional literacies, right? The literacy that we're accustomed to teaching in our classroom. Learning environment plays a huge role as well. And I referenced that in context, right? What learning environment are children in? Well, as a result of COVID, everyone has been forced into a digital learning environment. That doesn't mean that we're doing digital literacy. That means that we are responding to a situation by leveraging digital tools to help us communicate with our students. It doesn't necessarily mean we're teaching them digital literacy skills. So I want to bring that to your attention. And then, of course, the role technology plays, right? There's a huge role. Next slide, please. And I want to bring your attention or focus your attention on those higher level pieces, right? The skills that we want students to learn, some of the new pedagogies we're bringing into our classroom, the role that environment plays, right? Context matters. What I don't want to see happen, and what happens a lot, is that we focus on the trees. We don't see the forest. We focus on the tools that we're using in the classroom. And that's where again, we're teaching kids how to use a specific tool for a specific task, but we're not necessarily focusing on the skills that they're developing and or applying in those spaces. Next slide, please. When we speak of new literacies, what we're really trying to say is that literacy is not just new today, but that it becomes new every day of our lives, and that we really need to move learning into literacy-rich network learning environments. For those of you that are in primary thinking, okay, this is a lot, this is heavy, what does this look like in a grade 1 classroom? I'm going to speak to that now. But it's really, really important to lay this foundation that literacy is new every day because it's driven by and informed by technology. And when our children are using technology, they're being tested in some ways to determine, how literate you are in this environment. And we as teachers have a huge responsibility to ensure they are literate in the digital environments where they're spending most of their time now. Next slide, please. And the piece here is really it's not just about transforming literacy instruction, it's about transforming all instruction to meet the needs of today's learners. And when we think about the role that technology plays, learning environment, right, the context in which we're exploring different contents and ideas with students, in addition to the new pedagogies that we're bringing into the space, whether it's inquiry-based learning or blended learning or problem or project-based learning as an example, we're also being mindful of, I totally lost my train of thought. We're also being mindful that it's not just focusing on developing literacy skills, but it's skill development. Those transferable skills is really the focus of the work that we're doing. And next slide, please. So when we speak about designing new literacies, we're talking about new forms of literacy that are made possible by digital technology. And I'm going to pause and I want to say that again. So new literacies are forms of literacy that are made possible by digital technology, okay? All kinds of digital technologies. So when I talked about the trees, those are some of the digital technologies. The literacy skills we develop are in response to the kinds of technologies that are being put out there and how we use them, okay? How we communicate on them, which comes back to, when you were defining literacy at the beginning, it's really about communication and our ability to do that well. So next slide, please. So we should be on 31, Ian.
We are.
Perfect. We're a great team here,
yeah.
You and me. So what if we read the curriculum with a lens to the future? Next slide, please. I want to focus on decoding and reading comprehension. So, and if you haven't read this slide yet, I'll give you a second to read that. So hopefully you got it. If you can read this, thank a teacher. All right, next slide, please. So I want to focus on reading comprehension, and I'm going to speak to decoding as well in some of the examples that I bring here. So I framed it as sort of reading with a lens to the past and reading with a lens to the future. Traditionally, historically, when we're teaching students how to make inferences, and I've taken this right out of our elementary curriculum document, we would teach kids, as an example, we might use a narrative text, right? We would teach them inferential reasoning about settings, events, problems, solutions, characters, and, same holds true in elementary or secondary. We might ask specific discussion questions like, what do you think is going to happen next? Or what evidence in the text suggests this? And when we think about reading traditionally in the classroom, that's maybe what it looks like. When we talk about reading with a lens to the future, we're going to use informational texts, maybe search engine results. And I want you just to take a minute to think, have you ever used search engine results as an instructional tool to teach inferring? That's really the question that I guess I want you to think about. And how would you infer information from a set of Google search results? And what does that look like to teach it explicitly to students? Because that is an application of their ability to infer in a digital environment, which is, again, this is your new literacy, right? This is literacy in a digital space, informed by new technology developments. So which of these sites, as an example, a question might ask is, which of these sites is a commercial site? How do you know? Where was the site produced? And what evidence suggests that? So we can still teach the skill of inferring, but we're doing it in a digital environment. So here's again where context matters. And we're using information that we're teaching students to gather from the internet. Next slide, please. So I am going to pause for a minute here, and then I'm actually going to break this lost the word, sketch note that a colleague of mine did for me. I'm going to break it down into pieces. And what I wanted to show you, though, was sort of the whole process. And so this sketch note highlights new literacies of online reading comprehension. So basically what I want you to take away from this is that this is what teaching reading comprehension would look like in a digital environment, right? In a digital context. And the new literacies are the skills that students are developing to not only comprehend, decode and comprehend, but also communicate the information that they're reading online. Okay, so I'm going to break this down into little pieces here. Next slide, please. We're going to start with the first 4 points on that sketch note, which speak to our ability to locate information on the internet. And I do teach kids as young as kindergarten how to locate information on the internet. And it's very intentional, and I would be doing the same thing in grade 12. I think one of the dangers that we make, or one of the dangerous assumptions we make as educators, is that because our students are digital natives, they come with all of these skills and understandings about digital spaces and navigating digital content, because we see them on their devices and they're zipping here and zipping there and doing this and doing that. It doesn't mean that they have a solid understanding of the information that they're actually taking in. It means that they've learned how to navigate a space. So imagine that you've walked into a mall. You can read the floor plan of a mall and figure out where all the stores are, but you haven't actually been in all the stores. So you don't know what's in the stores and you don't know what's being offered. So students might have sort of that, bird's eye view map of what's going on in the space that they're in, but they don't necessarily know what's behind all those closed or hidden doors. So when we teach students to locate information on the internet, we begin with a keyword search. We would then teach students how to choose a web browser or search engine. So some of you have joined today in Chrome or Firefox or Safari. And then we would teach kids how to actually use keywords to filter content and conduct a search online, and then read and infer search results. So those 4 things I've packaged under how we locate information on the internet. Next slide, please. I know we started 10 minutes late, so I want to be mindful of that. One of the things that I wanted to ask here, and maybe Ian will just take like 30 seconds to get a brainstorm from people. The question is, how do we locate information on the internet compared to using books or print text? What's similar or different? So take a couple seconds to think about that. And if you could just share some of your initial thoughts in the chat. I just want to get your brains going on this particular question.
Okay.
How do you find,
Yeah, Leigh, I'll just leave you with this because someone's asked a question, and just if you're able to answer it at this point, just after folks have put stuff in the chat, is the websites that you're asking. I think it's minors or students to research information on it. So I'll just let people populate the chat. I'll come back to you with things here.
Okay, perfect.
So books we can just flip through or use the table of contents.
Yep.
The index or glossary.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Yeah, there's kindergartens, number sign, internet specific, straight to the answer, similar to both ability to decode text, ability to understand what they're reading. In a book, we look into contents. On the internet, we just search with keywords. Internet search, go to specific sites, keyword search. Those are a few that have come up.
Yeah, that's great. And sorry, was there a question too, you said, Ian?
Yeah, it was just about what sites or internet sites minors or students you're asking them to research on.
Oh, what sites do I use?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting question, because that then positions me as the locator and curator of content. So I'm hesitant to answer that question because it's a process that I would actually work through with my kindergarten students, and I would model thinking aloud as I'm doing things and explaining how I would search the internet. And whenever I look for content for my students, I search the internet in real time with them so they can see everything that I'm doing. I don't go home and do it by myself. Cool. So it's built into my lessons.
So go ahead. There's an answer.
Yeah, that's my answer, I guess. Yes.
Yeah.
And the value add is that I'm modeling just like I would model with the text that I was holding up in my hands or under my document camera. The thinking that I'm doing as I'm reading text, right? I would model how I'm making predictions and making connections and inferring. I do the exact same thing on the internet. When I'm searching for information in a print text. Actually, Ian, do you want to flip to the next slide just while I finish answering this? When I'm searching for day, okay. That's not in there.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So would you switch to slide 37 for me?
Sure.
Perfect. So just to wrap up that response, the short and long of it is anything I would model in print text that I would do in the classroom, I would do the same thing on the internet. And I think we have to be very careful because it's very easy for us to go home and spend an hour researching and finding those best sites for kids. But what we've done is we've removed a hugely important part of the process and learning for them specific to new literacies, right? It's developing the skills of locating information. That's what we want kids to be able to do, okay? Because if they can locate information, that actually alleviates you or solves the issue of you going home and spending all your time doing it. We want them to be able to do it, right? We want to empower them as users of the internet. So as you can see here, I worked with a class of grade 7 students, and this was, we spent a decent amount of time on this, and just comparing, how we're locating information using internet and books. And one of the things I'm going to draw your attention to is some of the similarities between the two spaces. And again, this is a slide you can come back to following the session today. Next slide, please. So I'm sure especially my elementary folks, we teach nonfiction text features, and this just gives you sort of an example of a set of those. And I know that's happening at the high school level too, where those nonfiction text features are being reinforced just at a more advanced level with more involved. Slide 39, please. So what I want to do is start to draw your attention to some digital text features that are also nonfiction. But again, this is moving from print text to digital text, okay? And I said to Ian, hey, can you send me those first few slides? I'm gonna share you've already got the nice arrows on there for me, showing you some different examples of some of the text features that we need to highlight and explicitly teach to students. And I'm going to spend just a little bit on this slide and a little bit on the next one. But as you can see here, Ian has circled icons. And each of those icons symbolizes meaning, right? Symbolizes something. There's something there. There's information there that needs to be unpacked. And when I've been leading Google Meets with my kindergarten kids, the very first thing that I did was I talked to them about, the tools that we use in the classroom, and they could give me all kinds of tools we use in the classroom for learning. And I talked about our video conferencing platform as our virtual classroom, and these are the tools that we need to be successful in our virtual classroom, right? We have a microphone, and this is what it does, and this is the picture. We have a video icon, and this is what it means, and this is what it does. And we have, the phone receiver that none of you recognize because you're all digital natives and you've never actually picked up, an old school telephone, but that's how we leave the call. So we go through those tools, right? We have our chat box, we have participants in the room, and these tools were referenced for you early on to ensure that you could access the information you need during this session. Right? And that's a new literacy skill that we take for granted, and we do automatically when we visit a website. We scan, right? We take in the information that we need. We know how to interpret these images. Our kids don't necessarily, and I think we make assumptions that they do. Next slide, please. And I've given you another example here in a Google Hangout. I would say there are probably 1 to 2 mini lessons that you could pull just from by teaching students how to navigate a video calling platform, whether it's Zoom, whether it's Hangouts, whether it's Skype, Cisco, it doesn't matter. All of those platforms have tools that students need to use to communicate. And each of these tools, each of these tools in the platform can be tied back to one or more curriculum expectations in the English language arts curriculum. It's spending the time, not just teaching kids about the space, but also helping them make connections between spaces. So, for example, the slide that I showed you previously, there are icons there that show you how to use your microphone and how to use your camera. They may look slightly different than what you see in Google Hangouts Meet, but what's important for students to recognize is that those icons have similar meaning and there are connections to be made there. Another important teaching point when doing this is, where is the information located? So when you use a print text and teach kids to use, the index or the glossary or a menu, a table of contents actually, let's go with table of contents. What does that look like in a digital platform and where do I find it? If you can identify those three little dots in the bottom right-hand corner, that actually means menu. That is table of contents, right? This is where information is located, and there's lots of information behind this tiny little button. And so it's important for students to recognize that a menu on a digital page is the same or similar or can be compared to a table of contents in a book. And it's making those connections between print text and digital text that help kids develop that fluency between spaces. Next slide, please. I now want to bring your attention to a set of Google search results. There are probably 20 mini lessons here, potentially. So when we talk about teaching kids digital literacy skills or new literacies, this is it. It's engaging them in the spaces that they're using online and taking time to teach them what each of these, what each of the icons means, what each bit of blocked text means, why is some text blue and why is some text green, how is color used to communicate meaning and information, where are the menus, right? Because on this particular page, there are multiple menus. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 menus on this page alone. Now, I don't want to freak anybody out, but my question would be, how many of these are you able to name and explain to your students? Because this is a point of reflection. It was a point of reflection for me years ago to say, wow, like I don't know what that is, and I don't know what it means, and I don't know why it's important. Being able to name and notice all of those pieces for your students. And if you don't know what all of these things mean, and I'm going to go ahead and show you the answers. Next slide, Ian, please. This is all information that you can actually find on the internet, right? That's the best part. And you can work through all of these pieces with your students to learn it with them. You don't have to show up knowing what all of these pieces are and how they're all named and what they all mean. Explore it together. That's one of the most valuable ways your students can see you positioning yourself as a learner. And it's one of the most authentic ways to connect with your students. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides. These are more here as a point of reference. It's very, very important today that kids understand how to read a URL. And a web address can be compared to a home address, right? I live at 77 Kittredge Avenue East in Strathroy, and this is my postal code. All of the information I just shared with you communicates something unique about where I live. A URL or a web address does the exact same thing, but we need to actually teach our students what each part of a URL means, because each part of a URL communicates information to them that helps them understand where they're going, why they might want to go there, and whether this is a valid or reputable space to be. And even in kindergarten, I teach my kids, so there are things they can look for, right? You look for the .ca or the .org or the .gov, again, depending on where we are, because that each of those codes, codes following the domain name carries meaning. HTTP compared to HTTPS. I teach my kindergarten kids that when you see the S means safe. And 5-year-olds understand that. This is a safe website. You don't want to go anywhere that doesn't have the S for safe. Sorry, I totally transitioned into my kindergarten voice there, my bad. Next slide, please. And I'm going to leave this here too. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is here as a reference for you. And there's a link at the bottom. Actually, a couple links at the bottom just with some additional information. But this is a checklist for you that you can use with your kids. And again, series of mini lessons right here. There's what, 12 maybe? 12 mini lessons that you could be using with your kids. Teach them how to search the internet. It's one of the most valuable skills you will be able to offer. Next slide, please. So the next section that I want to come to, and again, referencing back to that sketch note, is evaluating a website. It's one thing to be able to find information, but the next piece that we need to teach students is how to evaluate whether that information is safe, is current, is relevant, is what you need. And what I see happen all the time, and I mean, I'm guilty of it myself, is that I conduct a web search and have an unprecedented confidence in the search terms that I've entered to not look past the first 3 results or the first page. And that is it's an oversight that we all make, because really what that does is it really limits the amount of information we're being presented with based on a whole number of factors that Google, if that's our search engine, takes into consideration when searching the internet. Next slide, please. So again, this is here for your reference, and I'm not going to unpack all of this, but I think you can see the mini lessons right here, right? When we build an evaluation tool for a website, which I would strongly encourage you to do with your students as a process, as opposed to handing them a website evaluation form, there's a lot to be discovered approaching this as an inquiry. How do you know the information that you're reading is safe? Your kids will surprise you with regards to what they come up with. And I think there's also a lot that you can then offer to fill in some of those blanks. Next slide, please. And this is strictly just for you. Again, I'm not diving into this. This is a resource for you. I've provided, I have here 2, 4, 6, 7 different websites, and the challenge is to determine whether these sites are fact or fiction. Some of you may have seen the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. That is a famous one. The Velcro crop is also a good one, but I've tried to include some ones that you may not have heard of, and I also tried to pick some ones that actually make it somewhat challenging, whether you're a student in grade 5 or grade 12, to actually determine whether that information is true. Next slide, please. One of the simplest takeaways from the evaluating a website piece is this real acronym that you can use for reading the URL, provided you understand what each part of the URL means. Examine the content on the site, ask about the author, and then look at the links. Even if your students just complete those 4 tasks, they will have validated information on a website that is likely brand new for them. I would say most students don't take the time to do that. And this needs to be a part of part of their process every time they visit a website. Next slide, please. The next piece before we move on to some classroom examples and how we communicate information is just synthesizing it. Next slide, please. This is a slide that I'd like you to spend some time kind of mulling over. Synthesizing information is a complex multi-step process, and I could spend a whole hour just talking about how we synthesize information. Again, this is a sketch note that my colleague Joey Jackson did for me when we think about and we talk about synthesizing information online. And when we, for my kindergarten colleagues here, my grade 1 colleagues that are here, there are pieces within the process of synthesizing that little people can do too. They can organize information by identifying, the big ideas or keywords. It's something that takes time, yes, but that's the first piece that they need to learn, the first piece of this puzzle that they need to learn. Little kids, little people can also connect their new learning to prior knowledge. That's something they can do. And we're already teaching kids to make inferences, even as young as kindergarten, more specifically about, how people or experiences make them feel based on the information that they've encountered. But there are ways to do that at least lay that foundation for them to build these skills as they move along. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pause here. I know I've covered a lot. I would like to go until 10 after 5, if that's okay, because I do have an hour's worth, and I hope that you're able to stay on. I do apologize for the tech mishap. Any questions up to this point?
Leigh,
then I want to share. Yeah,
Leigh,
go ahead.
all I'll say is if folks need to leave past past 5 o'clock, that of course we'll have the archived version of this. So if you've missed just the last 10 minutes, you know, we'll all understand that you know that you have other pieces in your life. If you can stay, that's great, and if you can't, you won't miss out on the archived version. I appreciate your flexibility, Leigh. This wasn't your issue, so we'll just if there are questions, I can read those back to you if folks put those in the chat box.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't I keep going? And if anything comes up, just let me know. So we should be on slide 51.
We are.
And so now we're going to talk about communicating information, and this is where I'm going to explore how students are actually creating content, doing some of that writing. Sorry, I'm going to finish up with the reading, and then we're going to look at what that writing looks like in these spaces. So next slide, please.
Okay, and I have a question for you if you want to take it now or afterwards.
Yeah, no, let's do it now.
Okay, so Sarah's asking, how do you ensure when searching the internet with kids in front of you that nothing bad comes up, question mark, with carefully choosing your search terms, question mark?
There's no simple answer for that, other than, you know, it's my expectation and my hope that your district IT department has ensured that the proper filters are in place for you and your students when using the internet on your networks. So you do have that layer of security and protection that you don't have when you're searching at home. You as a classroom teacher, in collaboration with your TRA, and again, it's I know it's referenced differently in different school boards. Your tech resource assistant, you have teacher librarians, you have hopefully teacher librarians in your schools. I know more at the secondary level, but there should be someone in your building that helps oversee as well the technology in your school. The devices that your students are using should also have certain settings in place that prevent them from viewing any explicit content or being exposed to any explicit images. But those settings, and this is a good conversation for you to have back at your school. Hey, are all of my devices set up that way? Do I have all the security pieces in place? I can tell you that when I taught grade 2, I was one of the first people in my district, this is a long time ago, to go one-to-one with devices. And I had that exact issue happen where the appropriate filters had not been set at the system level, and one of my students ended up looking at pictures he shouldn't have looked at. The lesson out of that, though, and what I had modeled with my kids searching the internet openly in my classroom is, what do we do when we find something we know we shouldn't be looking at or we know is inappropriate? And that's really what we want to be teaching our kids. It's not preventing them from finding something maybe they shouldn't. I think that's a first line of defense. But more importantly, we need to teach them what to do when they do, because they will, and it's inevitable. It's inevitable. And so being able to provide kids with some strategies to respond to and deal with content that they find that maybe that makes them uncomfortable or that they shouldn't be seeing really should be a teaching point, right? That's one of those teachable moments as well. And I think that's how, the best way we can handle that in the classroom. Any other questions?
I think we can come back to one afterwards. But
okay, sure.
We're on slide 52. Yeah. You tell me if we want to go back up or go ahead.
Yeah, no, we're good on 52. So the reason that this is here is just as a reminder that we are talking about new technologies, which are positioning students in new digital contexts for learning, which require them to develop and apply some of those new literacy skills that we're talking about today. So if we move on to slide 53. I want to talk to you about the value of Twitter as a platform for learning in the classroom. And it's a platform that I've used for years with my students. And I lead a global ed student chat that I'll reference today as well. But I want to talk to you about some of the pieces that kids can learn just by reading tweets. So next slide, please, Ian. And just one click and you'll have the first box. So I'm going to share some tweets with you that I really enjoyed. These are any Jimmy Fallon fans out there. I'm sure there probably are. His hashtag mom texts are the best. So I grabbed a few from there, and I want to speak to some of those. So if you've read the first one, I received 12 consecutive completely empty text bubbles from my mom the other day because she was trying to unlock her phone. That speaks to, how we feel when we first enter a new space, a digital context, right, a new platform, and we don't know what to do, and we don't know where things are. And these are some of the things that happen. If you can just hit enter to make the next box come up.
That's there.
Perfect. The next one, my mom couldn't figure out punctuation, so she would type it out, "How are you?" ? So again, this speaks to our fluency within a space, and can we find the tools that we need to be able to communicate what we want to. And this also demonstrates that Jessie's mom solved her problem in a different way, right? She couldn't find the question mark, but she figured out how to communicate meaning in an alternate way. Next slide, please. So there are 3 on this slide, okay? So on Valentine's Day last year, my mom texted me, "Enjoy your VD." This particular tweet brings to light how we use abbreviations on social media, because VD, what Holly Lou Harris's mom thought she was expressing or communicating, and what was actually communicated are 2 very different things. And I'm sure you've all had issues with text messages going all wrong, really, for lack of a better way of putting it. And this is an example there where the meaning that you're trying to communicate was not communicated because you didn't have a clear understanding of how different acronyms are used on the internet. Can you click again for me?
Yep.
All right. The next one reads, "I got an A in Chem. WTF, well done." Mom, do you know what WTF means? Well, that's fantastic. So another example, again, of someone trying to communicate but misusing some of the language that's being used on that platform or across platforms that actually means something else. Can you click again for me?
Okay.
And the hashtag. "I'm learning how to hashtag." That's great, Mom. And you have to be reading this to appreciate it. And she types out hashtag conversation with Sen. Hashtags carry a whole nother set of meaning. Hashtags identify us with a specific community. They can be used in a very similar way that we use parentheses in writing, right? When we put something in brackets to communicate that little extra bit of information. Hashtags are also often used as a way to communicate humor, to engage people in something that's funny. Next slide, please. So what does this look like in the classroom? Next slide. And I had referenced Global Ed Student Chat, and we rebranded. We started out as an Ontario-based student Twitter chat, and I lead a team with Jen Cassell of students in grades 7 to 12 who every month build questions that are based on topics that were crowdsourced on Twitter from students not only in Ontario but across Canada and other parts of the world. And we host a Global Ed Student Chat every month on a different topic. This month, the topic is "What is school?" And the reason I chose to keep the On Ed Student Chat snapshot here is because on the next slide, Ian, if you don't mind, what this does, Twitter has changed the layout of their platform. And I wanted to keep this slide for 2 reasons. One, because what it does is it shows all the information that you need to access on Twitter on one slide. Number 2, it also really addresses, I think, one of the challenges that we have all experienced as adults when we go to a space that was once familiar and now everything is different. And this is where we have to apply our skills as literate individuals to orient and navigate a space that was once familiar that is now unfamiliar. And one of the challenges that presents is I think it really differentiates people that are literate in digital environments from those that are not as literate. And again, it comes down to our ability to make connections and see relationships and have a familiarity with, well, where is that information usually found? Like if I want to log into a website, where do I usually go? Top right-hand corner, almost always. But that doesn't mean that it's always, right? Sometimes it's in the bottom, sometimes it's in the left. but you know what you're looking for. And the reason I wanted to share this slide is because each of those arrows represents a mini lesson or, you know, bring some arrows together. There are so many mini lessons that all connect to the English Language Arts curriculum that can be taught using this text. Sure. So there are some other slides in here that I encourage you to take a look at, and I've given examples that you can use in your classroom for mini lessons about profile on Twitter, right? Because we have profiles on all kinds of platforms on the internet, and it's like asking a student to write a bio, right? A biography in Google Docs. Building a profile online brings other elements in, right? Avatar, graphics, hashtags, different text forms that allow for the communication of more information. Information about handles and tweets, and I have a really great video with Justin Timberlake and Jimmy Fallon about the hashtag, so make sure you check that out later. Slide 65, we should be.
Yes, we are.
So I'm going to frame a little bit of writing, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap things up, because the information that's a lot of the information on the slides in the rest of this deck really create, I think, a pause for reflection, and also give you ideas about some of the things that need to be considered. So if we're on 66 here, so I want to shift thinking or focus from reading to writing in digital spaces. And I'm going to go back to writing with a lens of the past and writing with a lens to the future. So with a lens to the past, we would choose a purpose for writing, right? We would write to inform, entertain, describe, or persuade. And we would teach traditional forms of text like haiku poems, and I'm sure there are probably some nodding heads, set of directions, a timeline, a narrative, and our audience is typically other students in the class and the teacher, and kids would typically write independently or peer edit each other's work. When we think about writing with a lens to the future, what you'll notice is that the purposes of writing didn't change, right? What's changed are the forms of writing in the audience. And that's really what digital does for us, right? We have text messages, we have emails, we have blog posts, tweets, web searches, blogs. There's a little section here on blogs that you can refer back to. Those are the forms of writing that we can teach in the classroom that students are actually using in real life, right? They're using that today. I don't know how many students are going home writing haiku poems, right? After that sort of that mini lesson or unit is done. Does that mean that it's not a valuable way to spend our time? Absolutely not. I think exposing them to all kinds of writing and literature in all forms is valuable. What I'm asking you to think about is how much time you spend doing that compared to how much time you teach kids to write an email. Writing email is hugely important. That is a life skill they need today. Text messages, also hugely important. And there may be some of you that think, well, that kind of falls out of my scope. It's a text form that students are using every day, which I think arguably brings it back into, or brings it into a school setting and makes it a valuable use of our time. The beauty here is that the audience extends beyond the walls of our classrooms and includes all kinds of partners that are available to work with students in a collaborative way using a variety of digital tools. Next slide, please. This is a poem written by a grade 7 student. It's a haiku, of course. 5 syllables here, 7 more syllables there. Are you happy now? And the only thing I want to draw your attention to here is audience and how important audience is for students today. They spend their time on social media, craving audience. That's why we as adults flock to social media, right? We crave an audience. We crave connection. We want to feel that sense of belonging, and our kids are no different. And it doesn't matter if they're 6 or 16. They crave audience. And when you, the teacher, are the only audience provided to students, you will have noticed that at some point it loses its appeal. It's this no different than you being asked to produce all of this work for one individual every day, all day for an entire year. That relationship that you have becomes really important, but it's also so even more important for students to be engaging and communicating with others for a variety of purposes. Ian, I'm going to ask you to jump down to 73 for me.
73?
And I just want to give an example of memes. being a fun way to engage kids in some new forms of writing in digital spaces. And I chose Success Kid because you've probably all seen Success Kid. And I like this meme in particular. Teacher catches reading memes on school computer, laughs, and tells you to scroll down. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to read all these, but you get the idea. But what I want to focus on is Doug Belshaw's concept of remixing. And remixing allows us to borrow images online that we have permission to reproduce and add our own spin and twist to them in a really fun and exciting way. And further in the deck, following this, there's some examples of what those look like, some of the things that students have created. But I want to move to slide 85, please, Ian. Because really this begs the question of copyright. And this is the piece that I'm going to leave you with today, is copyright and attribution. Next slide, please. If you haven't or you're not familiar with a resource called Copyright Matters, I strongly encourage you to pick that up. It is an easy read. It's been written in a very accessible and friendly language for anyone to use. And what it does is it outlines your responsibilities when using content that you find online. Next slide, please. Far too often we send kids onto the web and ask them to find pictures. And what they're actually doing is they're going online and finding pictures that they don't have permission to use and to take and to download. And there are two tools that you can use to teach students how to do that properly. One of them is Google itself. There is a menu when you go to Google called Search Tools. And if you click on Search Tools, you're going to see a drop-down menu where you can actually choose what kind of images you want to search for. And this is how every student should be entering Google when starting an image search. I choose images, I go to Search Tools, and I choose images labeled for reuse. And if they're going to modify them because they're creating a meme, then they need to choose that. And then any images that students are allowed to use will be visible. Another tool to do that is on the same slide directly below, and that's using Creative Commons. And Creative Commons acts like a search engine in a sense, indexing or grabbing content from places where images are I guess where you've been given, where images may be reproduced, where the author has given that permission, or the creator, I should say. So CC Search is a web tool that you can use to find images that students are allowed to reproduce. Next slide, please. And this is here again as a reference and a resource for you. This is how to properly attribute content that you find online that again you found and you're allowed to reproduce. It still has to be attributed to the original author. And this is something that your students should be doing anytime they create something and share it online. They need to attribute their own work. Next slide, please. And Creative Commons has a fantastic tool that literally allows you to click, 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 and create your own CC license for your own work. And this is a really, really great way for students to develop an appreciation for the work created by others while also crediting themselves for the work that they're sharing online. So what I want to leave you with today, and Ian, if you could skip down to 98.
We are there.
All right. And the reason I want to bring your attention to this is that almost all of the jobs that students are going to do don't exist today. And that is a scary thought, but also it's real, you know, in 10 years from now. And all of those jobs require technology skills. And it's not just technology skills, and I think that's misleading. And this is information that I've curated, you know, from numerous reputable spaces on the internet. It's digital literacy skills, right? It's your ability to use the technology, which requires you to be digitally literate. Next slide, please. And I just want to caution the amount of time we spend engaging students in, you know, the cool tools for school. And I reference these because these are tools that are specifically used in education. Not that they're not used outside, but they're typically used in education. And there is a place for them. But I want you to think about how much time students spend using those cool tools. Next slide, please. because students are going to start asking the question, how is this real life, right? I don't use a Google Classroom when I'm not at school. Google Classroom is a virtual learning environment, just like a physical classroom is a learning environment. What we want to ensure is that we're balancing the amount of time students are spending in spaces specifically for school, next slide please, and how much time they're actually spending using tools that they will use in any environment, right, in any scenario, which are tools like Google, right? I own my own company and we use G Suite. We also use Microsoft. You know, Twitter is a social media space that we use. We use YouTube. You know, even the you know, photos and the camera, right? There are so many lessons that can be taught about how we use those digital tools because we use them all the time. And what I want to leave you with today, next slide please, are just two last slides that have you, provide you with some questions to think about before you integrate digital tools into your classroom. Nothing's changed, right? We start with backwards design. What do you want your students to know, understand, and be able to do, right? This is our purpose. Number two, what will you accept as evidence of understanding and learning? And this should all be familiar to everybody here, right? These are the questions we go through when we're planning a lesson. What knowledge and skills will students need to achieve desired results? Next slide, please. And then it's continuing the conversation. And these questions are more specifically related to your use of technology in the classroom. I didn't have a chance to spend some time talking about different methodologies for integrating technology, like using the SAMR model or TPAC, and there's information and resources and links in this deck for you. But the SAMR model gives us a way to think about tech integration. Am I just substituting something my kids could do with paper and pencil, or am I really using technology in a way that's redefining an experience of learning for students? And I don't feel that that's a space you need to get caught up in. I think more importantly, as a starting point, what am I doing? What would I be doing in my analog space? And what does that look like in a digital space? I think is the best place for you to begin if you're new to this. And if you're not new to this and you've been working in digital environments and the SAMR, hearing SAMR, the acronym SMAR, is new for you, I strongly encourage you to dig into that a little bit because it will help you think at a more in-depth level about how you're integrating technology. And if you're thinking, oh, I got SAMR, I've been doing that for years, I'm working in digital spaces, then the next methodology that I encourage you to explore is TPAC, TPACK, Technology, Pedagogy, and Content. That takes your understanding and integration to the next level. So there are lots of places to start and lots of places to build. And as I said, this deck was really designed, yes, as a tool for me to go through and talk to you about some different things, but more importantly, to provide you with resources, questions, and ideas for mini lessons that you can use in your classroom with your students. So Ian, I'm gonna, if you wanna throw it on slide 105, I'm gonna stop there. I know it's 5:17. I know we started late and I sincerely apologize for that. I'm very respectful of time. Any questions before we wrap things up today?
What I'm going to suggest that we do, Leigh, is I'll pause or stop recording, and then if folks want to stay behind who want to ask a few questions, maybe 5 or 10 minutes tops, and then I'll do an official thank you, and we'll close off the session, and folks can stay behind if they want to. How does that sound?
Sure, and I'm now in the room.
Hey, there you are. Good. All right. So let's do this. Just a moment. I'm going to stop share here. So Leigh, I want to just I want to start where you ended, just with the you had that thing. How are you going to overcome unforeseen challenges? And I think what we did that together by using multiple technologies in the modeling of that. Your computer, my computer, and my cell phone. So I want to
Yep.
thank you very much for that, for your ability to pivot and be flexible there. I think Unflustered must be your middle name. I also want to thank you for putting together such a rich and authentic webinar for us, with just so much to process and unpack. I know you'll leave us with lots of things to contemplate and some really practical resources to further our learning in this way. And you've just reinforced again that idea that, you know, it's pedagogy that comes first, and then it's the tool that you're attaching to accomplish those goals is such an important piece. And of course, you underscored that at our OTF Pedagogy Before Technology conference when you were the keynote there. And we didn't add that to your bio, but we'll do that here. So I want to thank you very much for that. I also want to take a moment to a shout out to my colleagues, Lindy and Jason, behind the scenes for all their work to help us mitigate the technological problems that we encountered this afternoon. And lastly, I do want to thank deeply all the people and our colleagues and participants in this webinar for your flexibility and understanding as we work through these difficulties. I know you have a lot of demands on your time at these unprecedented times, and want to acknowledge that and appreciate you stopping by to spend the afternoon with us. So with that, just a couple of other things here, but the conclusion here, within the next sort of 24 to 48 hours, you will receive a link to an evaluation form for this webinar. We really value your feedback because it provides an opportunity for us to look back at what happened and plan for upcoming sessions, but also ones further into the future. You'll also receive the link that's here to Leigh's Google Slides, which she's kindly offered to share with you. And I'll just remind you too to check out the OTF Connects calendar. There's the bit.ly on this slide for upcoming OTF Connects webinars that are coming up in our series for through the balance of this month and next. So with that, I'll pause the recording and thank everyone again for coming. If folks want to stay behind to ask questions, they're more than happy to do so. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.